The US and China trade war is over, and Vietnam is the big winner. That's probably a bit hyperbolic to put it in those terms, but the reality is Vietnam stands to win in the trade war between China and the United States. This coming in from the Asia Times. Vietnam coming for China's electronics supply chain. So, as I said, Vietnam is going to stand to benefit the most from this war that continues to rage between China and the United States on everything related to commerce. So Vietnam posed a win from the next phase of China decoupling, but there's no time to waste in upskilling its labor force. So Vietnam currently benefits from China's Corona-19 lockdowns and the geopolitical tensions between the United States and China, especially in electronics manufacturing. The country flirted with its own zero corona policy and lockdowns, but in 2021 changed course quickly to have two-thirds of its population vaccinated by December of 2021. News leaked that Apple would move its iPad production from China to Vietnam in June of 2022. China's Xiaomi also moved the production of some of its devices to Vietnam in June of 21, thanks to investments by a subsidiary of Hong Kong's DBG Electronics Investment Limited. Samsung, an early entrant into Vietnam, invested in a US 670 million manufacturing plant in the northern province of Bac Ninh in 2014 and increased those investments to 17.3 billion nationwide in a little over a decade. Intel is doing the same. They've opened a $1 billion semiconductor assembly and testing facility in Ho Chi Minh City in 2006. So we see that the trend's been going on for quite some time, but now that with the trade war between China and US, this has just exacerbated the problem, and it's quickly grown so that China's become the darling of investment, especially when we look at these high-end products, electronics that every country wants to produce. So we know from a low cost production, typically countries start in at producing very basic things, very basic materials. It could be basic clothing or basic components that go into higher end electronics and higher end products. That's what has traditionally been the case in Vietnam. They've done a lot of lower end products and maybe some components, but those components were shipped to China, and higher end, more established facilities would then put those parts together and actually build the product. So now we're seeing Vietnam with the investments from some of the largest groups in the world becoming the darling and becoming the next place for big investment. So between 2010 and 2020, exports of electronics, computers, and components from Vietnam grew at an average annual rate of almost 30%, with double-digit growth even in the years prior to the U.S.-China trade tensions and the corona lockdowns. That was chiefly the result of domestic reforms in the mid-2000s, namely 2005 enterprise law and 2000 investment law. These regulations, fully implemented in 2015, allow foreign firms to acquire majority shareholdings in domestic enterprises. That enables Vietnam to participate in the global parts and components trade as foreign firms in these production networks are no longer interested in joint ventures with local companies. They would prefer to become owners to control quality, ensure timely delivery. So again, what that's looking at is saying, okay, we don't want to just outsource to a local provider. We actually want to own the facilities. And that's why it's so important for Intel and Apple and these folks that are coming to Vietnam. They want to own the entire operation. They don't want to outsource that to a third party. The cost of doing business in Vietnamese cities is significantly lowered, and or was significantly lowered in the mid 2000s, making Vietnam regionally competitive. FDI grew rapidly and was supercharged by the so-called China Plus One strategy pursued by multinationals, particularly in electronics. So you think about it, China was always the place people put their money in first. China was always that place, but they always wanted a backup. And Vietnam has traditionally been one of those locations that they back up and ability to have additional supply chain options. As an exporter of electronics, Vietnam jumped from 47th in 2001 to 10th in 2020, with an export value equal to 1.8% of the global value of electronic exports. Now, that's still small comparative to what China's doing, but you can see that Vietnam has grown significantly over the last 10 years, and we're going to see this number jump more and more over the next 5 to 10 years. Lower labor costs are an obvious advantage for Hanoi. Hourly manufacturing labor costs in China and Vietnam rose between 2016 to 2020, but they rose more slowly in Vietnam. In 2020, Vietnam's manufacturing labor costs were about half of that of China. Now think about that. China, we always know, is a low cost place to produce, but over the last 20 to 30 years, the standard of living in China has continued to increase, which increases wages, increasing cost, increasing everything across the board. So then the cost to make products and to produce things in China has significantly increased. And so Vietnam is becoming a much better place from a labor production and a labor cost standpoint. Electricity rates were 3 cents less in Ho Chi Minh City than in Shanghai, where the time taken to obtain an electricity connection was 1 day faster for firms and households. Other administrative reforms include improving the efficiency of tax filing and reducing overall tax rates by 2%. Vietnam's government has been proactive with apparent success in promoting foreign investments in electronics manufacturing and in machine Vietnam in global production networks. But longer term issues need to be resolved to entrench the country as a high tech manufacturing hub. Absolutely right. The government's done everything that they need to do up to a point, but there's long term issues and long term problems that they will have to address if they want to actually compete at the scale of China. Much of the electronics manufacturers in Vietnam currently focus on midstream activities in the supply chain, the assembly of finished products for export by foreign companies. Again, that's what we said. They're producing, from electronic perspective, they're producing some of those midstream things and then sending them off to China or other countries to actually assemble and made in China or made in XYZ country. Upstream activities such as product design and subcomponent production take place in other countries. The United States and South Korea often complete product design, while China does subcomponent production. Downstream activities such as sales and distribution also take place overseas. This explains why Vietnam's value-added manufacturing exports is on average only 55%, to the extent that a significant component of electronic exports is not local. Vietnamese firms cannot take full advantage of free trade agreements such as the EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement finalized in 2019. To move up the value chain, Vietnam urgently needs to upskill its labor force. Yeah, absolutely. Definitely need this. That will potentially provide footloose foreign companies with the skilled labor they need to expand production. And what we're seeing is as we saw in China over the last 40, 50 years, in Vietnam, there's an influx of individuals leaving their rural villages, leaving their small towns, and coming into the big cities, looking for jobs, looking for higher paying jobs. And with that, though, comes a need to train and to hire individuals that are well trained in these jobs. And so what happens a lot of times is a lot of the production facilities actually want to be out in the rural areas because it's cheaper. Now you have problems with transportation, problems with just other issues, as in some crime and other things that can take place in the more rural villages. But you actually want the labor market to go back out into these rural villages because that's where some of the jobs are. The expertise gap is currently being filled by expatriates and some Viet Qs returning from overseas. Some small South Korean component manufacturers are moving to Vietnam to supply Samsung, but this short-term measure cannot replace education and training. So again, we're having foreign countries, the South Koreans or the Americans, either putting expats here or they're putting up hubs here that they bring in people from the home country to help run and operate the companies and the machinery until local staff can be trained. But that's going to take some time. Engineering is not a big skill here, unlike in China. There's not a lot of the higher technology skills available. And so for this country to continue to grow, those skill bases have to improve. The need for upskilling is recognized by the Vietnamese government in its social and economic development strategy of 2021 through 2030, but the government is missing a sense of urgency, concrete steps, and quantified targets. And it is, and I think that's a difference between the Vietnamese government and the Chinese government. The Chinese government is much stronger at centralizing power and pushing reforms where they see the need well down in the future. The Vietnamese still haven't done a good job of pushing these reforms and pushing people into these opportunities and pushing the country along. Vietnam still struggles to do that. While Vietnam's average length of schooling is about 10 years, second only to Singapore within Asia, its tertiary school enrollment rate is 28.6% in 2019. So again, lacking significantly along in those schooling rates. Out of an estimated 6.9 million people of tertiary education in Vietnam, just under 2 million are enrolled in tertiary studies. So again, if you're looking at it from a long-term perspective, that workforce isn't trained and isn't educated. And Vietnam has to do a better job of starting early and getting individuals and kids into schools through high school and then enrolling them either into technical programs or college. That's going to take a central planning from the Vietnamese government to help bring that along. With Vietnam's favorable demographics forecasted to end by 2040, there's no time to waste in upskilling its population. So that's kind of where things stand in a nutshell. What we're going to do in a few other podcasts or in a few other videos coming up is we're going to look at some of the actual companies that are moving over, and it's shocking to see some of the companies that are taking that flag out of China, or at least partially, and moving them into Vietnam. And companies that we've always associated with working in China, being part of Chinese government or workforce, and now seeing them uproot and move is quite shocking. But it's a great opportunity for Vietnam and other Southeast Asian countries to take advantage of this trade war, which again isn't over, but it is certainly benefiting some of the other countries in the region. So please, thank you for taking the time to watch this video. If you do like it, please give me a subscribe. Please give me a like or a comment below, and I hope to see you at the next video. Thank you.